Good afternoon, everybody. This is Robert Fuentes with the ENO Center for Transportation. I want to welcome you to the latest in our ENO Center for Transportation webinars. Today, we present our Ask the Experts series, where we're going to talk today about AV 3.0, FAA reauthorization, and much, much more. Joining me today are a few ENO experts. We have Jeff Davis, Senior Fellow and Editor at ENO Transportation Weekly, Brianne Eby, Policy Analyst, Alice Grossman, Policy Analyst, and Paul Lewis, the Vice President of Policy and Finance. This Ask the Experts webinar is one of our benefits available to ENO members only. So thank you all very much for being ENO members. The goal of this webinar is for us to share some thoughts and expertise about a set of critically important transportation topics and to engage in an interactive dialogue with each of you. The webinar is particularly timely, I think, given the administration's rollout of the latest AV guidance, as well as the big FAA reauthorization. But there's many other topics, things like positive train control, there's upcoming ballot measures, there's new mobility services, a whole lot of things that we can also talk about. So we have about 30 minutes for the webinar. The plan is for Alice and Jeff to start off with a couple of comments about AV guidance and FAA, and then we will take your questions and comments. Please feel free to ask questions about any topic, not just AVs or the FAA. Please use the question function on the webinar website to submit, and you don't have to wait until the end to submit questions. And in what may be an unnatural act here in Washington, we do not have slides or PowerPoint to present, so it's just going to be on the audio side. So I want to thank you again for joining us and taking your time today. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Alice Grossman.
Great. Thank you, Rob. So just to give a bit of an overview of what is in 3.0, it's building on the last Federal Automated Vehicle Policy 2.0 from 2017. And a lot of language is really just sort of enforcing and encouraging the voluntary policy guidance that they had in 2.0, but then also adding on a little bit, I'm talking about some studies and definitions that DOT is taking on. So one of the main points that they make is encouraging the voluntary safety self-assessments for manufacturers. A couple of manufacturers have already done them. There's 4 that have, and those are posted up on DOT's website. They also focus on the fact that they're remaining tech neutral. So some of you may have caught in ETW a couple weeks ago, we had a point counterpoint moderated by Paul Lewis and written by Hillary Kane and Jess Nigro on sort of this 5G versus DSRC question. And DOT is really trying to stay out of that and say they're remaining tech neutral, they're not requiring anything, they're not restricting anything, and we should see where the market takes us. They're maintaining the SAE levels of automation, 0 through 5, from no automation to full automation. But they are thinking more about what the definitions of some of the words in those definitions are. So they're looking at how to define driver and operator, so you can look at what an automated system that's operating a vehicle might be in control that might not be a human driver, or also somebody who might be remotely controlling that vehicle. They're also going to re-examine NHTSA standards, looking at sort of those equipment things that might be different. So maybe some of these AVs aren't going to have steering wheels, and what requirements do we have for that type of feature in the vehicles that we need to adapt. Another main point that they made in 3.0 is that this is a multimodal, multi-administration policy. So 2.0 is very focused in federal highways. 3.0 makes a point of outlining the role of NHTSA, the FMCSA, a little bit for the FRA, PHMSA, FTAA, et cetera. So the main points there, beyond some of the NHTSA responsibilities that I already mentioned, is also the FTAA just put out a report on automated buses, looking at the effects on public transit there. And then FRA is looking at really still more the automated vehicle side, but how vehicles are interacting with rails at grade crossings and the potential safety benefits there. Then also FHWA is taking on their major overhaul of the MUTCD, the Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices, which is due for an update anyway. The last one came out in 2009, but they want to make sure that we all know that they will be including automated vehicles in this revamp of the document, and probably a number of other things as well. They also touch on a bunch of studies that they want to get done moving forward. So one important element that people have been talking about a lot and that ENO has been working on is this idea of the future workforce and the impacts of automation. So they will be conducting a study which will be a joint effort, actually, of DOT and the Department of Labor and Commerce, looking at the impacts of automation in transportation on the upcoming workforce. One other notable aspect that they actually took away from the former policy is the 2017 proving grounds for automated vehicle testing. So those are no longer designated proving grounds, and that doesn't actually have much of an impact, except for the fact that the $60 million that they are making available for grants for automated vehicle testing is now going to be opened up for anybody to apply to, not just those proving grounds. And that reinforces the message that they're trying to send, that they're trying to encourage innovation everywhere. This shouldn't be limited to certain areas, and they're hoping that everybody's going to move forward. In terms of what's not in 3.0, there's not a large discussion of cybersecurity, which is one concern that a lot of people have brought up, which is both from a national security perspective and personal privacy and security perspective. I'm going to say this, even though everybody might not agree with me, that there's not a lot of attention to bicycles and pedestrians in there. And so from a multimodal perspective, there's this active transportation and interaction element that still needs to be worked out. And that's really going to be more on the manufacturers, given the lack of guidance in 3.0. That's about all I have as major points. There's a lot in there, so feel free to ask about some more details.
That's great. Thanks so much, Alice. So before we jump into questions, I want to turn it over to Jeff Davis, who'll give us an update on the FAA reauthorization.
Thank you, Rob. I'll talk a bit about FAA and a couple of other things that have been happening. So we got an FAA reauthorization bill finally for the first time since 2012, and this one is a long one. It was signed into law on October 5th, and so that puts it just 5 days short of 5 full fiscal years. So it's 4 full fiscal years plus 360 days, and so that's both good and bad. So on the one hand, everyone has a lot of certainty now on what programs are going to be authorized for the next 5 years. For airports, we have 5 years of pretty much guaranteed money coming out of the Airport and Airway Trust Fund in advance that airports can plan for. On the other hand, that means that it's going to be very difficult to change anything for 5 years. So from the airport point of view, they're not going to be able to go try to get a passenger facility charge increase that easily for another 5 years. Although, the appropriations process may be open, although what Chairwoman Collins tried to do last year may have been a one-time thing in that bill. Similarly, people who didn't get what they wanted in this bill, some of the more activist members looking for more consumer protection restrictions on ancillary fees, especially, and those things will have to also wait for another 5 years. EAS reform planted down the road for 5 years, and there's always the chance that the facts in the air, as it were, or in the marketplace on drones and UAS could change substantially enough to require some kind of midterm tinkering between now and September 2023. But in any case, the legislation is done. It's 5 years, a total of $96.7 billion authorized. It's got a lot of things that have been percolating since 2012, particularly for those of you who fly a lot. The Lamar Alexander's a happy man. They've got the statutory ban on voice telephone calls in airplanes, which we've all been looking forward to. Anyone who saw the news on Bloomberg today about the squirrel being brought on board a Frontier Airlines flight yesterday in Florida as a kind of emotional support animal, Section 5.7, the bill does include a requirement the FAA actually make a rulemaking defining what a service animal is going to be consistent with the Americans with Disabilities Act, make it consistent across airlines, define what's emotional service animal certifications, etc. All kinds of stuff in there. A whole bit on certification reform, making it easier for American manufacturers to get new aerospace parts to market certified and also to defend those certifications overseas in the competition against other foreign manufacturers. A good bit of a little more certainty around, how the FAA can regulate unmanned aircraft, particularly around fixed sites, around emergency areas, and redefining the model aircraft exemption, etc. So that's done. That's off the. So there were only basically 3 or 4 non-appropriations transportation legislation bills that were in play for the remainder of this Congress. The FAA bill not only contains the FAA bill, it also contains the Transportation Security Authorization bill that was pending between the House and Senate Homeland Committee, and on the aviation side, the Senate Commerce Committee. It includes the maritime transportation portion of that. Those had been separate bills previously, so that's now done. And the Senate today passed the Water Resources Authorization Act, the 2-year word of bill, by a vote of 99 to 1. Surprisingly, the one no vote was not Richard Burr, who was supposedly filibustering this bill behind the scenes because he was hung up on it not reauthorized in the Land and Water Conservation Fund. It was Mike Lee from Utah, one of the least watery states, except for the Great Salt Lake, of course. And then also we've got the start of the, so that's another thing that's done. That's cleared to the president's desk. He'll sign it, in the next couple of weeks, probably when it does him the most election advantage. And then we've also got the start of the fiscal year that just happened on October 1st. So the Federal Highway Administration apportioned $42.355 billion in gross highway contract authority to states. Then they netted out $39.6 million in sequestration. So you've got the full $42.3 billion of net contract authority for the full year fiscal 2019. That's already in states' hands. However, they're not able to obligate that money or any year carryover money without an obligation limitation. And so yesterday, the Federal Highway Administration sent states the interim obligation limitation under the CR through December 7th. So October 1st through December 7th, I forget how many days it was, but it's 18.63% of 365 days. I can't do simple math in my head. So of an assumed prorated $44.2 billion ob limit, a total of $8.24 billion was released under the CR, and of that, about $6.59 billion went to states so that they can obligate for that contract authority they've just had, plus contract authority they had on hand previously. But also, one thing it did make clear is that the amount of money out of that highway spending that's taken off the top at the start of the fiscal year and reserved for allocated programs, both new allocated programs, overhead, and also the unobligated carryover from prior years, keeps getting bigger. If you just divide that amount that was taken out, it was almost 1.5 billion allocated program taken out of this ob limit. Divide that by 18.63%, you get $7.9 billion of 44.2 taken out and reserved for later. That's 1.1 billion more than last year. And by coincidence, by comparison, about 5 years ago it was about half that, but $4 billion in 2012, 2013. So the more money that gets taken out of the program on October 1st or thereabouts and held back means that, for the most part, if that money's not spent, then the states will get it back in August. So it's just a question of how much of the highway program obligation authority is held back from October 1st until September 1st of each year. So it goes practically from being start of 1 year obligation to almost the end of the fiscal year. It's another way of laying things out because the TIPIA program and the fast lane grants have grown so much and spent so slowly that they're kind of dragging the spending rate of the rest of the program down a little bit. Beyond that, we've got the rest of the appropriation bills that haven't been enacted already or hung up until December 7th. There's going to be an election between now and then, and nobody's quite sure exactly how that's going to play out. So be happy to answer questions on any and all those topics at the end.
Terrific. Thanks, Jeff. You actually started to address some of the questions that are already coming in, especially about the approps process. So keep those questions coming in, folks. You can use the questions function on the website there. Let me go ahead and start to pick and try to combine a couple of these. We'll start with the AV 3.0 guidance. And Alice, let me turn this one to you. So what are the major concerns or omissions that folks are expressing that are in 3.0. What are the big concerns that are out there right now?
Well, with regards to overall, one of the main concerns is that it's not adding a lot of testing requirements. It's voluntary guidance, and when you read through the document, it really stresses this is voluntary guidance, this is voluntary guidance. And you do see some manufacturers stepping up and submitting those voluntary safety self-assessments, but they haven't all. And so there are people who are concerned about that. From the active transportation side, there are a lot of people who worry that there aren't more testing requirements for interactions between vehicles and other road users, especially, you're always going to have more edge cases, and you can't test for all of the edge cases. So how do you reconcile that and worry about the implications there? People have talked about doing sort of vision tests for the automated systems, just as we have vision testing as humans before we can get our driver's license. And looking at sort of more guidance for communication. With that said, the policy does have a nod to complete streets, especially in the context of looking at the automated buses. And they do mention that this is a problem. It's just not as much giving solutions.
Yeah, that's guidance. That's what it's designed to do. Right. And Jeff, let me stick with the FAA with AVs for a second. Couple of questions here about what do you think the prospects are for AV start? That's the legislation that's in Congress. Now we have the guidance, but what does it mean for the legislation, do you think?
The legislation is held up for reasons that largely don't have much to do with the guidance. People were hopeful that there's always been at least one hold going on, usually about 4 or 5 behind the scenes. And lately, they've been largely on the Democratic side. The one big thing that's been holding it up was that the trial lawyers decided they wanted a provision in there making sure that arbitration agreements couldn't be forced on people in the AV sphere that would deny the full range of lawsuits, in the event something went wrong. And every time that, and that's the issue there. Arbitration agreements are something that are really focused on throughout the entire economy, throughout the entire policy sector, not just AVs. But every time that they lock in on that, it seems to lead to legislative death. People were kind of hopeful that since the bill was passed out of committee in the Senate unanimously, that would have been enough to get enough Democrats on board to hopefully attach AV Start to the FAA bill or some other kind of must-pass item. It hasn't happened so far. We look like we've got one more week of Senate session to go. The Senate will be in this week, and they're scheduled to be in next week. And then it becomes a question of, will Leader McConnell let senators go home to campaign, knowing that more Democrats want to get out of town than Republicans at this point? And what will he be able to get in exchange for that? And so the AV people are trying to make one last pitch this week and maybe early next week, contacting all Senate offices, trying to say, hey, there's a chance we can get some kind of agreement to get this thing cleared by UC before the end of next week. Let's try that. Otherwise, it goes into the large morass of things that have to be dealt with in the lame duck session. Anything can happen in the lame duck session. No one knows who's going to be, who's going to be controlling either chamber in next year and what effect that knowledge might have on people in the lame duck session. But there's still some behind-the-scenes efforts to get AV Start cleared before the elections, but it's more likely to get kicked back into the lame duck session at some point. And since all the bills in the lame duck session are probably going to get combined in just 1 or 2 big packages, is there room for that in theory for AV Start? Sure, but nothing's guaranteed.
Very interesting. So there is, I think the reports of its demise are maybe exaggerated. There actually is a prospect, and there is a vehicle here. Let me stick with the. It's
not dead, but again, there are no guarantees. And in the Senate, unanimous means what it means in the Merriam-Webster dictionary. Any one person can torpedo it, and it's unlikely that they will be able to bring it up in a way other than bring it up unanimously in the next 10 days.
Right. So, a challenge ahead of us for sure with the AV Start bill. Let me stick with the AV question too, and let me direct this one, Brianne, to you. the question is how is the FTAA vBus report related to the 3.0 guidance? Maybe describe what that is, and then see if we can answer the question. How is it related or is it not?
Yeah, so this report, it's called Transit Bus Automation Project, Transferability of Automation Technologies Final Report. So this came out last month in September of 2018, and this is separate from 3.0, and this explores the feasibility of transferring existing technologies in automated systems to transit buses. So over a longer term, how can we transfer existing technologies at a smaller scale to larger scale transit applications? So it's also looking at technical and safety challenges associated with this transfer. And what this report does is it breaks these transfers down into the kind of easier, more tangible ones, things that would require minor modifications to scale up into a transit setting. And so what FTA labels as minor modifications are things like object detection and collision avoidance. They have a kind of mid-level range, things that would require major modifications, but that are feasible. So this is things like lane keeping, steering assist, docking, and then they have a final category, things that FTA thinks would require new technologies, and this would be things like automatic emergency braking, reverse brake assist, that kind of thing. And so those are going to require a lot more attention if they scale up to the transit level.
Great. Jeff, let me go one for you. I want to go to the FAA bill for a second. The questions are about what happens now. Is the committee staff going to develop section by section guidance? Does that come out now? When can we or should we expect that on the FAA reauthorization?
There was a section by section overview summary that was published by the House TNI and Senate Commerce committees last week. That's online somewhere. As far as any more detail, that's about one sentence per section. Anything deeper than that, they didn't do a full, deeper analysis of each section like they would have in a committee report, and that's probably not going to come from the Hill. That'll have to wait a few months for FAA to formally digest the thing. We put together a list of all 109. We did our own basic section by section summary, sort of overview by theme, and then we've also done a list of the 119 new reports that are required, the FAA or somebody to submit to Congress at some point here in the next couple of years. And I'm finishing the thing on the 18 or 19 new rulemakings that are going to be required by this, and when they're phased in, it'll be out later this week. But aside from the section by section that's on their website now, I'm not sure that the Hill is going to be producing much else.
Mm-hmm. But folks on the phone should know that the Jeff Davis section by section analysis is going to be much more robust and worth your time. So as members, you have access to Transportation Weekly and all that analysis. Jim, let me ask you one more question about FAA. There's a workforce element that's included in that legislation. Can you describe a little bit of what that is?
It was in two parts. They acknowledge that there are going to be workforce issues coming up in the future, and part of this is the FAA may have been kind of remiss in the past on this. They require, I know, FAA to finish a final rule that they were in the past, modernizing the training programs at aviation maintenance technical schools. There's a big GAO study on the workforce of the future. But there's the workforce of the future. Then there's a subtitle on women in aviation. So it's and sort of an advisory board discussing that. Then there's the section about trying to encourage STEM education and but studies and task forces and boards trying to encourage people to seek out aviation workforce-related jobs in the future. Not much really solid there for the time being.
Got it.
Aside from the actual order of FAA to update the guidance and the rules for aviation workforce schools, and then authorizing a small grant program for projects to support workforce. There's like $5 million a year or something set out of the ops budget, I think.
Right. Okay. Well, Jeff, let me ask you one more. There's a bunch of questions just trying to clarify. You ran through a couple of things that are on the approach side, on the word of bill, some things that we can expect. Is there any other congressional activity that we can expect? We're kind of entering the silly season now, but between now and the end of the term here.
The Coast Guard bill is still out there. Congress usually finds a way to pass that. I'm pretty sure they haven't. A lot of this stuff was held up this year because the House Homeland Security Committee was trying to assert itself and pass a big DHS authorization bill, and that had to include stuff from other committees. And so Schuster was kind of deferential to them and holding back the Coast Guard bill and letting Homeland include that in their bill and all that. And the Senate was not having it. And so the Senate has now passed TSA on its own, and Commerce wants to include Coast Guard somewhere else. So it's passed both chambers. They're waiting to figure out for the House officially to acknowledge that the House Chairman McCall's concept of a global DHS authorization bill is dead, in which case we'll try to move that in the lame duck. Beyond that, there'll be some kind of future appropriations package required by December 7th. We're going to have another shutdown. The border wall thing is going to be the big problem there. And then there'll be at least one other non-appropriation must-pass package of some, items put together, flood insurance, et cetera. And we're trying to deal with that. But, that's all we know.
Yeah. No, it's more than I thought, too. Alice, let me turn to you. It's just someone wants you to clarify. Can you talk again about what happens to the money for the proving grounds in the AV bill? We mentioned that. Just maybe some clarification about that.
Sure. So in 2017, right before the administration switch over, DOT announced 10 proving grounds across the United States to do sort of federally sanctioned AV testing. And so 3.0 takes that designation away, but this isn't actually a big change. There is some great research coming out of those proving grounds, but there's also been great research on AV testing coming out of non-designated proving grounds. So it's really DOT acknowledging that there's a lot going on in different places, and there's no reason to have certain specially designated areas versus other areas. And so the implication that has on funding is the $60 million that they have appropriated to give towards automated vehicle testing could still go to those areas, those previously designated proving grounds, but it could go to other places as well if they feel like that's a better use of the money.
Right.
Let me clarify that just a second. Of the $60 million provided in the FY18 omnibus for this, $20 million was specifically set aside in the conference report for the AV proving grounds. And so the fact that the administration says they're not recognizing those designations is not sitting well on Capitol Hill. So the administration is saying behind the scenes that regardless of how they structure this competition for the $60 million, that they're pretty sure that the 10 designated proving grounds will wind up with at least $20 million, but they're not gonna, say that at the beginning. So that's a big bone of contention right now between the appropriations committees. So we'll see how that happens.
Got it. That's great. We're right at 3:30, so I'm going to go ahead and stop the call now. I want to thank you all for your participation. We weren't able to get to all of the questions. I thought the really great comments, though, and good thoughts from the team here. Brianne, Paul, Alice, and Jeff Davis, thank you all very much for participating. For folks on the phone, if you want more information about ENO and about a lot of the things that we talked about here on this call, you can visit our website at www.enotrans.org. Since you're all members, you should be receiving ENO Transportation Weekly, an invaluable resource on all aspects of transportation policy and practice. If you're not, please feel free to reach out to any of us, and we can get you connected with that subscription. So once again, my thanks for your participation. Have a great afternoon, everybody.